سنبدأ الآن، ورجاء تنبيه المشاركين خارج القاعة لكي يعودوا إلى القاعة ولكي نبدأ الجلسة. مرحبا بكم جميعا، ونتمنى أن تكونوا استمتعتم بوجبة الغداء. حسنا، نمضي للجلسة الثانية تحت عنوان أفريقيا في سياق المجتمع الدولي. والميسرة هي السفيرة التي مثلت إثيوبيا في تايلاند، سريلانكا، الهند، وكذلك أيضا مثلت وزارة الثقافة وكذلك وزارة الخارجية، وهي أيضا معيدة في شعبة الشؤون السياسية. يسرني عظيم السرور أن أرحب بالميسرة السفيرة تزتا مولوغيتا. صفقة حارة لسعادة السفيرة تزتا مولوغيتا، والتي ستقوم بتيسير الجلسة. طابت ظهيرتكم جميعا. أتمنى أن تكونوا استمتعتم بوجبة الغداء. في الفترة الصباحية كنا نناقش مختلف المسائل المتعلقة بهشاشة الدولة في أفريقيا، وتطرقنا إلى مختلف المواضيع. وعلى الرغم من أن هنالك العديد من التحديات، ولكن هنالك أيضا العديد من الأشياء التي من المهم جدا أن يتم مناقشتها في القارة الأفريقية. ولهذا من الأهمية بمكان أن نتذكر بأن موضوع القارة الأفريقية هو مهم للغاية. لماذا؟ لأن أفريقيا هي القارة الشابة، وأيضا هي تنعم بالموارد المختلفة، وهنالك العديد من الموارد الطبيعية، الحجارة الكريمة، وهنالك العديد من البلدان وكذلك الجهات الغير حكومية التي تود أن تعمل مع أفريقيا والدول الأفريقية بصورة عامة. وهنالك أيضا العديد من القطاعات المختلفة، القطاع الأمني وكذلك أيضا القطاع العسكري. وإذا ما نظرنا إلى موضوع هذه الجلسة أفريقيا في سياق المجتمع الدولي، فلدينا ثلاثة من المحاضرين. أولا لدينا الدكتور إدريس آيات، وهو باحث وأكاديمي في الشؤون الأفريقية من نيجير. رحب بالدكتور إدريس آيات إلى المنصة. وأيضا لدينا بوهانيا غويا، وهو بروفيسور في العلوم السياسية والعلاقات الدولية من الجزائر. شكرا لك، تفضل. والعرض الثالث سيكون من السيد كولونيل أدماسو، العقيد أدماسو، من الكلية الحربية للجمهورية الإثيوبية. تفضل، مشكورا. شكرا لكم جميعا. فإذا لدينا المتحدث الأول، المحاضر الأول، وهو السيد إدريس آيات، وسيقوم بتقديم ورقة حول تحت عنوان أفريقيا والعولمة الشخصية الأفريقية والنضال من أجل الهوية. فإذا ربع ساعة للمحاضر الأول السيد إدريس آيات، تفضل الكلمة لك. مرحبا بكم.
أتمنى أن كل واحد جاهز لما سنقوله، لأنه الكثير من النقاط وخاصة فيما يتعلق بالهوية هي نقاط غالبا مزعجة، فرجاء تحملوني. عنوان مداخلة اليوم هي إفريقيا العولمة، الشخصية الأفريقية وصراع الهويات. كما تعرفون الهوية لها علاقة بكل ما هو بالذات عند الشخص ما أو جماعة ما اجتماعية في جميع الأزمنة وجميع الأهوال، فهي تتعلق بكون شخص ما أو جماعة ما قادرة أو قادرة في الاستمرار أن تكون ذاتها وليس شخصا أو شيئا آخر. هذه الإشكالية فتحت الباب أمام الصراعات التي تعيشها هذه الهوية أو الهويات الأفريقية مع قضية العولمة أو هذه المفاهيم. محاولات عديدة بمحاولة تفسير معانيها. أحيانا أعداء العولمة يصفون بأنه فرصة جديدة لاستعمار العالم.
Another people who also claim that this is perhaps something that is beneficial to mankind. So everything that I have mentioned.
القارة الأفريقية أو على المثقفين الأفارقة والأكاديميين لمحاولة تحديد أطر ومقومات وأسس وعناصر ما هي الشخصية الأفريقية وما هي الهوية الأفريقية مقابل الهويات الأخرى، وكذلك أيضا مقابل العولمة نفسها. لذلك محور حديث اليوم ستكون عبر 6 نقاط. النقطة الأولى تكون تعريف العولمة وتأثيرها على أفريقيا، وثانيا تأثير العولمة على التنوع الثقافي الأفريقي، هل هو تحديد أم فرصة؟ والنقطة الثالثة فقدان الهوية في أفريقيا جنوب الصحراء، حالة دراسية وخاصة صراع الهويات. والنقطة الرابعة العلاقة بين الانتماء المحلي والضغط العالمي الناتج عن العولمة. والنقطة الأخيرة إعادة بناء الهوية الأفريقية ومستقبل الهوية الأفريقية في عصر العولمة. أن أعرف تعريفا بسيطا وسطحيا للعولمة. في القرن العشرين ظهر مصطلح العولمة كصيغة تعريفية أكثر فاعلية من الصيغة النعتية لما كان يستخدم سابقا من غلوبال أو العالمي، بينما كان يستخدم مفاهيم مثل الكوني وكذلك لنفس الدلالة. وكانت العولمة قد ظهرت بالتوازي مع مصطلحات تاريخية أخرى مثل التحديث والتصنيع بالاقتران مع أفكار ما بعد الحداثة. وفي أواسط القرن العشرين سادت صورتان مؤثرتان جدا للعولمة في الخطابات الأكاديمية والخطابات العامة على السواء. وهكذا وفي البداية شهدت القرية العالمية أو ما يسمى بجلوبال فيليج، كانت الإرسالات الأولى لما سيعرف لاحقا بالعولمة عند مارشال ماكلومان، وهو يتحول إلى مجتمع واحد مشدود الأواصر نتيجة نمو وسائل الإعلام الجديدة في الاتصال الإلكتروني. وثانيا شهدت أيضا نظرية إيمانويل وولشراين عن النظام العالمي انبثاق تصوير جديد.
If you look at the different relationship between different countries, and towards the end of the 20th century there are some developments that came out as a result of this constant discussion. And Karl Marx, he came up with an imperialist notion, and he mentioned that having a market that would spread the bourgeois would lead to Could you please notify the speaker to speak a bit slowly? Those listening in English, please. Could you please notify the speaker? The interpreter cannot follow. The interpreter cannot follow. Could you please notify the speaker to speak slowly? He's being interpreted. So according to Karl Marx, I explained the phenomena of globalization in here. We have to understand that globalization is closely related to the African character, and globalization was mostly focused on different notions, and at the outset, of course, it had to do with the different variables in Africa, and as a result of colonization, and there were also some fears that globalization would lead to westernization and Americanization. So as a result and as a byproduct of colonization, you have different languages that manifested themselves in Africa, be it English or French. And you also have the mainstream media, for instance. Mostly the media language is English or French, and you have Netflix, YouTube, among other things. So given the fact that I have finalized the definition of globalization and try to look at it from the lens of an African perspective, I would like now to move to another point. So when I was preparing this paper, I tried to look into who an African is. For instance, if you're from North African, you're not African enough. That's the term that's being used, just because you're light-skinned. So this is was not something acceptable. Why? Because where they live, they're not regarded as citizens, or perhaps regarded as second-class citizens. And Paul Gilroy, among other scholars, mentioned that being an African has nothing to do with the continent, but it has to do with the DNA, with the genes, with all these aspects. And then another definition emanated for post conflict, and we have also, and then we have Ali al-Mazru'i and others, and those tried to have a definition as far as who's an African is concerned. And he mentioned that to have an African identity is something that would involve common denominators, and we have to look into the critics. The critics mentioned, for instance, if there is a father who's an Arab and a mother who's a Kenyan, then definitely the person can actually be an African. And Al-Mazru' mentions that it is important to have proper understanding of the phenomena of an identity. And now we can move into the issue of perhaps Qaisi Said, for instance, who is saying that Africans are trying to somehow occupy North Africa, and this kind of rhetoric is not helping. Of course, I don't know in which continent he thinks he is. So it is important to be very careful as far as this kind of issues are concerned. And in Ethiopia, for instance, so I know that in Ethiopia there's this notion that some Ethiopians are not Africans and they're not there in between somehow, or there's the use of maybe the word of Habasha, among other things. So in a way, as I have mentioned, it is important to know that we have to look into the biologies here, and we have to look into the of course the specificities. For instance, having a straight nose, or maybe some kind of physique. This is something that relates you to Africa. So these are some of the definitions as far as who an African is and who's not. And I think this is, of course, there's very little room for consensus. And finally, I think what I can say is African identity is dynamic, and I think this is something that we have to look into, and we also have to understand the dynamics here, and we also have to look into the migrations. And for instance, if you look into the Algerians, the Egyptians, the Moroccans, etc., of course there are Arabs, but then again they're within Africa, but they're not Arab from the Gulf. So if the Egyptian or if the Moroccan go to the Gulf country, he's not fully Arab. So the same problem applies. So this is why we have to understand the intricacies here as far as the African identity is concerned. Now, with that, I can talk about two main extremes here, and this is with regards to discrimination, maybe, and of course the problem with this kind of thinking is that it's a narcissistic way of defining what an African is and what an African civilization is. So you have Al-Najashi, Aksum, or the Egyptian civilization, and others. And you also have the Pan-African movements as well, that actually have somehow estranged those who are a bit light-skinned, and the Pan-African movement has also had its own division, and we also have to look into the different faiths in Africa. You have the Jewish, Islam, and Christian faiths, and they say these are the religions that have come to Africa to impact the identity of Africans. And I think this kind of categorization is absolutely wrong, because it only diminishes the African identity and does not give it its full weight. So now the second thing that I would like to talk about as far as the extremes are concerned is the issue of Salem Bebe, Ambea, and a famous Cameroonian scholar, and he mentions that globalization is an opportunity in order to leapfrog this limited scope of thinking, and trying to look into the commonalities. So again, the problem with this kind of thinking, and for me the reason why I categorize it as an extreme view, the African Americans in America, while they were struggling for their independence, the social anthropologists somehow did not do justice as far as analyzing the issue is concerned. So for instance, Westerners, when they see an eloquent speaker who's an African, for instance Malcolm X, who was quite eloquent, and many people criticized him that he was trying to mimic a white man, and then of course you have the speech of I Have a Dream, Martin Luther King. So I think it is important to understand the identity of an African, and also we have to look into the notion of Africanist and blackness, and we need to leverage globalization. Therefore, we need to leverage the blackness and Africanism, and trying not to discriminate others as well. So at the end of the day, we have to not look into Africans as people who miss something in the community. So there's also another way of thinking and another theory, which is as far as having a common denominator is concerned, and here, as far as the third category is concerned, the African Union spearheaded this process, particularly in the year 2002, and having an African identity means having a language, and also building the African Union, and building the African Museum, the Grand African Museum, and making sure that everything is repatriated as far as the artifacts are concerned that are being displaced in many Western countries. And the other thing that I'd like to mention is the African Day, of course, on the 25th of July. Of course, you have the African Day, and this is something that harmonizes. And then you also have the massive project of protecting the Timbuktu civilization, and also having diplomacy, and then we also have different carnivals. Fespaco Carnival, which is held in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, so they display movies and other things. So also have fictions, novels, Chinua Achebe, and also Saida Diche في رواية in her novel mentions that she had problem as far as her personality is concerned. So an African person has some kind of bias. An African person cannot drive a car. So you see this kind of bias towards Africans. So again, the mainstream media, the Western media, somehow categorized Africans in a different category. And I think Chubuwe, she wrote a very nice novel. And then the other thing is with regards to Nollywood, of course, having movies. They produce, I think, more than 2,500 movies, and it's the second in the world as far as the quantity is concerned. It comes second to Bollywood. And then you also have the Afrobeat music, and this is also something that promotes. You have Burna Boy, for instance, Davido, Wizkid, Rema, and finally you also have music. So I think in conclusion, the future of African character in the era of globalization, while preparing this research, I understood that many of the scholars do have answers to the 5 main questions. Who am I? So this identifies the identity. From where do I come? My ancestors, where do they come from? And the third question is, why am I here? And what is my goal here? What's my project here? And the fourth question is, what can I do as far as this project is concerned? And the fifth question is, where am I heading? You have the Anglo-Saxon, you have the Korean, you have different, of course, civilizations, and they all have answered these questions. So who are we? Who am I? I think this is a question that has yet to be answered. And finally, I can reach this conclusion. So we have to not be afraid of globalization. We need to count on ourselves. We need to bet on ourselves, actually. And the second thing is, we should not extol in relating to old civilizations. So you have the Pan-Africanism. They say that, the Egyptian civilization, etc. So we need to be dynamic, but we need to have some kind of a balance to strike as far as identity is concerned. Now the third thing is extolling and holding to a specific identity without or with disregard to others. So those who do not know their past cannot know their future. I think this is a bit of extreme view, and you have anthropologists who have written on this issues. So for us in Africa, we need to know our future, and we also need to envision it, and we need to also understand our background. And the last conclusion here is that there is a dire need for anthropologists and historians in Africa at the level of the African Union based in Addis Ababa to once again look into the definition of Africans, because if we don't have that, then we will not be able to answer the 5 questions, and we're going to have so That's my conclusion. I think we need to answer the 5 questions. And with that being said, I would like to submit, and given that I have spoken about identity, I can say that thank you, and in Amharic, አመሰግናለሁ in Amharic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Idrissa, for the detailed explanation regarding African identity. Of course, we have heard how African identity is considered by others, what are the threats and so on. If there are so many questions regarding this, it's going to be developed during our discussion. So now we directly pass to our next presenter, Professor Buhari Goya. He's going to present regarding proxy wars and transboundary militias in Africa.
إذن شكرا جزيلا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to thank the organizers. I would like to thank the Al Jazeera Center for Studies and the Institute of Foreign Affairs. And I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to allude to the main issue here, the role of militias, cross-border dynamic as well. And I'm going to talk about the proxy wars in Africa and the concepts and the risks associated with it, because this is a very important issue, particularly when it comes to proxy wars. And we also have to perhaps mention that military groups are trying to involve in proxy wars, and proxy war is war. The concept applies to many, of course. A proxy war is a conflict in which at least two states or forces are indirectly confronted by other actors. So you have the problem with regards to the different things here. You have war is like opening the door of a dark room. You will never know what will happen when you open that door. And Adolf Hitler mentioned this in one of his books. And you have also, it's important to know that in a proxy war, some of the countries do not necessarily state that they are sponsoring Group A or Group B. And there are some parties that do not represent the notion and the doctrine of different countries. So when we talk about the militias, we have to understand the strategic dynamics here, and we also have to look into the pragmatic issues here. So we're talking about different theories. The militias sometimes end when they're defeated, and there's also another theory that these militias will exist even if they remain dormant, and then these militias also, we have the definition of course, the Wagner Group, for instance. You also have the cyber war, and you also have the Pegasus application, and I think you all have heard about the booby traps on the pagers and whatnot. So I think we can
كما قلت يتم طبعا دعم طرف بشكل مباشر أو غير مباشر، وهنا نقدر نتحدث عن أنواع الحركات يمكن أن نصنفها بكونها حركات.
So we have radical groups, we have terrorist groups, and they perhaps sometimes define themselves as Islamists. They Al-Qaeda, Tawheed and Jihad. We also have different groups. The Azawad group, the Higher Council of Azawad. So the origin of the term, the first to call the type is Zibinski, the advisor of Jimmy Carter. He used this concept, and this concept applies to many Cold War conflicts. Great powers have sometimes used governments as intermediaries, but terrorist groups or other third parties are often the most frequently used. And Proxy International, Journal of War, and you also have Andrew Mumford, The New Era, Proliferated Proxy War. And you also have Growth, The Utility of Proxy War in 2019. Of course, the history of proxy war is prolonged. States and empires have used them as military strategies, during the First World War. Britain and France used a similar strategy, similar Spanish Civil War in Afghanistan as well. And currently, as I have mentioned, it is being used by groups in Africa like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Congo, PLM, Lord Resistance Army, and quite a number of actors actually use this notion of proxy war. So, it continued all the way to the 21st century in Yemen, in Russia, Ukraine, the United States and its North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO allies acted as external backers of Ukraine. Madam Moderator, please notify the speaker. Interpreters cannot. He's speaking so fast. Yeah. So the risk of proxy war facilitating the emergence of political or military dictatorship such as anti-democratic government may emerge from a successful proxy war if the proxy goals are inconsistent. And you can see that militias have actually been used to prolong conflicts, and despite the fact that in Africa we have condemned the unconstitutional change of governments, Congo 20, I think Congo-Brazzaville 12, Burundi 12, military coup, and you have different statistics and this change from year to year. We have the first scenario here that proxy war is going to end and it will be in decline because of the loss of human life, in addition to the loss of life. Proxy war perpetuate insecurity and plunge African countries into a cycle of intergenerational poverty. So, this also leads me to this specific slide, and you have different numbers. 6.5% of weapons go into the hands of these militias, and you also have Russia, the main provider of these weapons, and of course Africa is an arena for international competition, especially the major countries, despite China's commercial dominance in the African continent. Russia is the most influential country in the field of arming the African continent in a heated race with the US, China and France. So, if you look at the militias and groups, given the fact that they try to surpass the state or work beneath the state, so the continent has seen more than 11,000 kidnapping cases, and it represents 48% of the kidnap rate in Nigeria. Stands first here. And you have Congo, and you have Burkina Faso, etc. So all these results, the African continent has led the world in abduction and forced disappearance, and according to ACLED data, where they have accounted for about 48% of the total kidnapping incidents in the world, and the crimes of kidnapping in the African continent has witnessed a remarkable increase. Now, as you can see here, the indicators of violence, the military in different countries did not or was not able to address this phenomena. This is why I need to say that Africa is facing quite a number of challenges, particularly with regards to the trading of weapons, and you also have illegal migration, among other concepts, and all this leads to fragile states. Now we also have this indicator on government personnel, 636 violence cases, and this is a huge percentage if we compare it worldwide. So, according to the African Center for Strategic Studies, the number of deaths associated with the violence by Islamist militants since 2021 group within the African has risen by about 60%, although this widespread within the region threat trajectories, actors and targets. Another tangible evidence, of course, is the evidence of deteriorating security situation in the Sahel, and the rise of violent extremism in Mali and Burkina Faso. Now another slide that I would like to shed the light on here is with regards to the militias and how they're being used by different groups, and you have a recent study that perhaps there is some kind of incoherent, inconsistent information provided, and as you can see you have quite a number of cases here. 72 cases in West Africa, you have Russia, and you have unknown areas or unknown proxies here. In China as well, and in East Africa 33, you have 21 in Central Africa, and you have 25 in SADC region. So you have, of course, the Western Front and Russia and China camp. So Jean says the difficulty lies not so much in finding new ideas as in escaping from old ones. Overcoming the Cold War mentality will not be an easy task, particularly in the spread of technology, which leads to the direct cost of the direct reduction of the cost of proxy wars. However, it remains essential to work for Africa's prosperity, to ease migration pressure, and to combat climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for the detailed presentation regarding militia and proxy war. Of course, being on a fast mode, Professor tried to tell us regarding the relationship between proxy war and militias, and how militias can play a role of proxy war, and how Africa is becoming victim on the matter. And the rest, I think, we can further discuss during the discussion time. And now the third presenter will be Colonel Maseret Admasu. He's going to present us regarding fourth generations war, interplay of present and future realities in Africa. Colonel Maseret, the floor is yours.
Member of the Ministry of Defense, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure for me to have this presentation and to say something about generation warfare in front of you. So most of the presenters mentioned asymmetric warfares, insurgencies and guerrillas. I will try to give more emphasis on the tactics, strategies and characters of insurgencies, guerrillas and piracies, because fourth generation warfare gives more emphasis such kind of activities, such kind of guerrillas, insurgencies and terrorists. Therefore, fourth generation
شهدها العالم من قبل. ولأهمية هذا الموضوع من المهم بمكان تناوله من منظور تعزيز قدرتنا على التعامل مع هذه التهديدات الناشئة. إذن سأتناول بداية مقدمة أو سأستعرض مقدمة قصيرة، ومن ثم سأحاول أن أعطي لمحة عن الأجيال الثلاثة للحروب التي شهد العالم فيما مضى، ما هي العوامل التي مكنت تلك الحروب ومدى تأثيرها على الجيل الرابع، ومن ثم ستكون هنالك خاتمة وبضع توصيات. إذن كمقدمة، الجيل الرابع من الحروب هو مصطلح عام أو شامل يستخدم من قبل المحللين في أو الباحثين في المجال العسكري من أجل وصف الحروب التي نشأت في نهاية القرن العشرين. كان هنالك أحد المفكرين هو السيد ويليام إسلند، والذي قام بإجراء دراسة متعمقة عن الأجيال الثلاثة للحروب التي شهد العالم فيما مضى، ومن خلال هذه الدراسات تتبين أن هنالك 7 أجيال في الواقع، 7 أجيال من الحروب كان وتمثل أحدها في الحرب السبرانية، والتي يمكن أن تعطل اليوم الكثير من الأنشطة الحيوية في البلدان، بما في ذلك خطوط الطيران، الاتصالات وغير ذلك. إذن هنالك أجيال عديدة للحروب التي يشهدها العالم، وسأحاول أن أعطيكم لمحة عنها. الجيل الأول من الحروب كان يركز على القوى البشرية، وكانت له آثار مدمرة. الجيل الثاني من الحروب والذي يمكن حصره بحروب الاستنزاف، أي أن يتم.
Therefore, it is a little bit better than mass demand power. Then third generation is maneuver, speed. The German military said, Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. Speed is very important to attack our enemies, because our enemies are dispersed. As an Africans, insurgencies, guerrillas, piracies are dispersed manner. Therefore, in order to achieve our objectives, we have to think about fourth generation warfare, asymmetric warfare. Therefore, fourth generation, as Lind develops, asymmetric in nature. Asymmetric. Therefore, first generation is characterized by this one: line and column, uniformed, drills, more emphasis. Uniformed precedence, lines and columns in the first generation. Close order formations, resulting partly from technological aspects, factors, especially used with the smooth bore, like this one, like this machine gun, okay? And especially the use of, the focus of enemy's front combat force as well as ownership. The focus of our enemy is in the front side because of the contact of our enemy with friendly forces. The front side rather than the rear side. When we see the second generation warfare, just artillery, indirect fire, gives more emphasis on the indirect fire and the rear side. First generation warfare, mass manpower, must give more emphasis on mass power. Therefore, it creates more casualties. Second generation warfare, developed by the French army during World War I. Indirect artillery fire, indirect attack by artillery, rather than using mass manpower. And still linear in nature, uniformed, drills, is common in the second generation warfare also. Characterized by fire, indirect fire, and heavy reliance on indirect fire, driven by technology. Just technology gives advantage to create these indirect artilleries, indirect fire artilleries. Therefore, mass firepower replaced mass manpower. This is a very important point in the development of warfare. driven by both ideas and technology. In this case, just it's driven by idea and technology. When you come to the third generation, more emphasis given for ideas rather than technology. Attrition focus on the enemy's rear. Doctrine, artillery conquers, the infantry occupies. The artillery try to disrupt the enemy, and the infantry will occupy the terrain. The terrain. Inward focus, rules, procedures. Obedience was very important in this generation. First generation, second generation, third generation, obedience was very important. Rules and regulations by the commandants. But when we come to the other generation, third generation and fourth generation, rules have not more important. Rather, it creates initiative. Initiative is important in the third and fourth generation. Artillery fire, indirect fire. Third generation warfare, non-linear in nature, and focuses on maneuver rather than attrition, okay? Here, it gives more emphasis on maneuver or precise firepower. Bypass and collapse the enemy. Pass and collapse the enemy at the back side. This is the character of third generation warfare. Concepts, blitzkrieg, the German's concept. Lightning war, lightning concept. The focus shifts from space to time. Just give more emphasis on time. More emphasis gives for time. Time is very important in the third generation. The speed, maneuverability is very important in the third generation. Order, troop order center. Just they give order to attack the enemy in the rear side. The rear side. Therefore, less casualty in the third generation. Because of time. Initiative is more important. Idea is more important in the third generation. Idea, rather than technology. Third generation primarily driven by ideas. Third generation military focus on outwards because of initiativity, creativity. And mistakes were tolerated at that time. In the third generation, mistakes were tolerated because of different creativities. And depends on self-discipline, not imposed discipline by the commanders. In the second generation and first generation, obedience was very important. Rules and regulation was very important. Over here, self-discipline rather than imposed discipline. Just attacking the enemy by pass. See, the speed is very important over here. Then I will come to the main focus, fourth generation warfare. Fourth generation warfare has much in common with traditional low-intensity conflict. It was common, but nowadays the tactic is different. The tactic is highly different because of the development of technologies. Our enemies are here and there. Our enemies will be in Afghanistan, our enemies will be in Somalia, our belligerents will be in Ethiopia. Therefore, it's dispersed in manner by its nature of guerrilla, insurgency, terrorists. Therefore, the difference lies in the manner in which fourth generation opponents adapt those traditional concepts in the present day by developing technologies. Therefore, fourth generation warfare is defined as conflicts which involve the following elements. One, complex in nature. Complex and long term. When you fight with when you attack the terrorists, justice needs more time. Even guerrillas needs more time. Even to achieve and to have a political objective, to achieve their political objective, they need more period of times. Therefore, it's complex and long period. Terrorism tactics, they applied a terrorist tactic. The guerrilla insurgency applied terrorist tactics. Transnational base, highly decentralized. A direct attack on the enemy's culture rather than the physical enemy. Just they try to attack the culture rather than physical attack of the enemy. Used available pressures, political pressure, economic pressure, social pressure, and cultural pressure. All available pressures, they exert the pressures. Occurs in low intensity conflict. The conflict is low intensity because of the asymmetric nature. It's not conventional war, it's a low intensity. Non-combatants are tactical dilemma. This is the main problem. Civilians are tactical dilemma because civilians will affect by these insurgents, guerrillas, terrorists. Lack of hierarchy. There is no hierarchy. Small in size, small in number. Insurgents, guerrillas, terrorists, small in size. Use of insurgency tactics, subversive, terrorist activities, and guerrilla tactics. Violent and non-state actors. They are violent and they are non-state. They don't have state. And the level of fourth generation warfare, they applied the 3 levels of fourth generation warfare. One, physical attack. The second one is mental attack. The third one is moral. This one is very important. Demoralize the society, demoralize the government, demoralize the people. This is very important concept in the asymmetric warfare, in the insurgency, guerrilla, as well as terrorism. Conventional techniques of warfare are declining in this manner. So no conventional warfare in terrorism, in guerrilla, in insurgency, in piracy, even in smuggling. No conventional warfare. Information warfare is applied, asymmetric warfare, media, propaganda warfare, and hybrid warfare are filling the gap of conventional warfare. Now state militaries find it difficult to imagine wars in any way other than fighting states in the same manner, in the same strength, the same capability. Unless otherwise, small countries cannot be achieve their objectives by confronting with the highly capable countries. Therefore, states militaries find it difficult to imagine wars in any way other than fighting the similar manner, similar to other countries. Many border regions in Africa provided safe haven for those insurgents because of the colonial border, because of the wide size of African borders. This is a safe haven for insurgents and guerrillas, particularly in Africa. There are different challenges, conflicts currently in Africa. Example, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, even currently in Ethiopia, Darfur. There are the protracted conflict in Democratic Republic of Congo. Just this kind of activities are asymmetric in nature. The northern region of Democratic Republic of Congo, southern Sudan, Rwanda, and northern Uganda could be regarded one of the conflict views open borders. So endless wars and extreme poverty in Africa creating disorder and instability. So endless wars, extreme poverty, backwardness, marginalization, as the first presenter said, it creates disorder and instability. Regions used political tools for mobilizing irregular warfare. Just we have applied political tools. Poverty, marginalization, political ideology, important motivator for irregular warfare, for insurgencies, for guerrillas also. Prolonging conflict holds benefits for some social groups. Some social groups may be beneficial from this conflict. For smuggling, and different activities. They will have different activities by using this fragility. Therefore, there was some beneficial societies from this disorder. This is for generation warfare, asymmetric warfare. Even the groups are independent, okay? Independent in nature. The insurgents, guerrillas are independently attack our society. The tactics placed on all fronts, economical fronts, diplomatic fronts, economical fronts, cultural fronts, and civilians also. Therefore, they will attack in all fronts, not separately the military. Characteristics of fourth generation warfare, lack of hierarchical authority. This is one problem. Lack of authority, hierarchy. Lack of formal structure. There is no formal structure in insurgency. No formal structure in asymmetric warfare. No formal structure in guerrilla. And patency and flexibility. They are flexible. Today they will be here, tomorrow they will be in other area. Therefore, ability to keep low profile. They will be hidden in the society. Low profile. Hidden in the society. Ability to keep a low profile, okay, small in size. The tactics, there are insurgent tactics, terrorist tactics, guerrilla tactics. They will apply these three tactics. Insurgent, guerrilla, and terrorist tactics. Okay? Variation from the previous one. Variation from the previous three generations. First generation, second generation, and fourth generation. And 1, 2, and 3 generation. The state and non-state actors. Okay. The state and non-state actor distinction. Non-state actors and state actors are different in the fourth generation. Civil and military distinctions. Greater dispersion. Less mass. Okay? They used less mass and great dispersion. Logistics, decentralized logistics. There is no centralized logistics in insurgency. There is no centralized logistics in piracy. There is no centralized command and logistics in guerrilla. Declare war is different. Non-linearity. The first generation warfare is linear, uniformed, drills. But here is non-linear. The determinant of victory is different from the previous one. The nature of the enemy is different. The importance of media. Media is very important. In the first generation, media was very important just to say we achieved in certain terrain. We conquered. We occupied certain terrain. In order to say media was very important. Currently, media is a machine gun, just used as a machine gun for terrorists and guerrillas. Use terrorist activities. And NGO also, the appearance of NGO just creates more grievance for insurgent activities. As a conclusion, warfare is wide spectrum that moves through 7 generations. Just now we are thinking about 7 and 8 generations. Just attacking the enemy without any contact by destabilizing the system, the technology. As an African looking at the future of warfare from previous perspectives, we have to emphasize transformed technologies. We have to give more emphasis on Africans. We have to give more emphasis on technology. Psychological, social, cultural, and societal factors will not be determinant because these factors will be targeted by technology. Currently, social factors, cultural factors is very important for fourth generation. But in the future, these factors will be targeted by high tech. Therefore, we try to give more emphasis on technology. African strategic vision, as a recommendation, African strategic vision of future wars should be dominated by high-tech, light forces, and controlled by tightly connected networks, allowing African leaders to see everything, decide rapidly, execute swiftly. Therefore, we try to, as I mentioned in the previous slide, it is better to give more emphasis on technology development. Africa's military is a secondary recommendation. Africa's military should restructure its forces in order to cope up the challenges of insurgency, in order to cope up the challenges of guerrilla, in order to cope up the challenges of smugglers and piracy. Just we need restructure our forces, capabilities, and adapt new approach to warfare, and effectively combine new capabilities, new approaches with new and developed technologies. My third recommendation, member states in Africa should review and adjust its national strategic warfighting concepts and force structures, and all efforts should be placed across diplomacy, information, military, and economy. Therefore, we have to give more emphasis, not only the military, we have to give more emphasis on diplomacy, we have to give more emphasis on economy and information also. grievance-driven causes of conflict in Africa need to be addressed. As the previous presenter mentioned, just we have to address the problems, the root causes of these problems. And African-led peace operations, military components also need to be better aligned with civilians to cope up the current asymmetric challenges. This is my final recommendation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colonel Masarat, for the detailed explanation regarding the 4G generation. In his presentation, Colonel Masarat tried to show us what looks like fourth generation of war and what are the different tactics, strategies, and the characteristics of the fourth generation war, and how it really affects Africa, and what measure or should be taken by Africans to cope with the timing in terms of the warfare. So under the title of Africa in the context of a global society, we have had 3 presentations which look specific and interdependent, but they have their own connection. So I hope you have learned a lot how Africa should stand in the global society, and how this the issues that were mentioned really affects Africa, and what kind of methods we have to use as a strategy to cope with the timing. So now the time is for question and answer, and I am going to as much as possible, I want all the participants to be brief and to tell us from which organization they are coming from and their name. So I start from here, second there.
المتحدثين. سؤالي الأول عن الهوية، وتحدث عنها ولكن بدون ما يتكلم عن كان في فراغ يعني، لكن الهويات دائما اللي يحددها هو الطرف الذي يمثل تهديد. يعني مثلا إذا كان من أجل الاستقلال فراح تكون الهوية متاع وطنية. إذا كان من أجل إذا كان في لحظة معينة كان المهدد ديني، راح يكون الرد اختلاف ديني والبحث عن الرابط المشترك الديني. فالهويات داخل المجتمعات هي المجتمع في عدة موروثات، كل مرة الهوية يصعد فيها جانب من الجوانب ردا على التهديد، فهي ليست في فراغ، لا نحددها يعني بمفردنا، وإنما في اللحظة التي يكون فيها ما هو التهديد الأساسي، فنحن نشكل أنفسنا على حسب التهديد اللي يعطينا خصوصيتنا حتى نحتمي بها. ثم الجانب الآخر هو الجانب السياسي الذي كنت أتمنى أن تتحدث عنه، هو أن الهوية والمشترك يكون كما يقولون للنصر 100 أب، للنصر 100 أب والهزيمة يتيمة. وكل ما كانت المجموعة منتصرة كل ما الجميع أراد أن يشترك في مع نفس المجموعة، فيعرف نفسه مع المجموعة المنتصرة. كلما انهزمت كل واحد بعد ذلك يقول أنا أختلف عن هؤلاء ولست منهم، ويبحث عن هويات أخرى مختلفة عن الهوية الواحدة. الأستاذ بوحناية قوية يعني في ما تفضلت به. أنا يبدو لي في إشكال في تعريف الحروب بالوكالة، وخاصة إحنا كجزائريين. يعني جبهة التحرير الوطنية كانت كذلك تتلقى مساعدات، فالإشكال هو كمثلا جبت بريجينسكي نفسه ويستعمل حتى ينفي الجانب الوطني على هذه المجموعات، كأنها تشتغل لأجندات خارجية وليست مكونات وطنية. فأنا أعتقد يعني يحتاج هذا إلى شغل حتى لا يكون الكل متشابه، وهو ما تستعمله إسرائيل حاليا مع حماس، هم وكلاء لإيران كأنهم يشتغلون لأجندات خارجية. بالنسبة للعقيد يعني هو تفضل بتحديد مجموعة من المراحل، يعني جيل أول، جيل ثاني، جيل ثالث، والآن الجيل الرابع، في حين في الكتابات على الاستراتيجيين هي يعني متداخلة. يعني مثلا
with regard to the different generations of warfare, some of the old wars that the Ottoman Empire waged had some form of asymmetrical wars due to the difference or the disparities between the capabilities. So if the one actor is weak and the other one is strong, the weaker party will always avoid direct confrontation with the stronger party. It might tend to adapt some tactics to maneuver. So the weaker party will focus more on attrition. So if we can say there was some form of the older generations are still present. And you mentioned, you indicated some of the wars that were waged by Napoleon, but I think there are still some form of non-linearity in the current warfares. In other case, we can always find some form of characteristics between the older generation and the current generation. There are some interplays between the past and the future. In Algeria, when there were some national movement that were struggling for liberation, those national movement waged asymmetrical wars against the French colonizing power. Today, we wage wars against insurgents, against, as you said, guerrilla warfare or other kind of wars that some way or another adapt the same technique.
Many hands raised. I want each person who asks a question to be specific and limit his question maximum of 2, if possible.
Okay. My name is عبيد إيميجين. سأقتصر طبيعة الحال بسؤال واحد.
I will pose one question to Dr. Ayat with regard to African identity. There are many analysts and activities that focus on regional identity, and they try to highlight the characteristics of African context. Do you believe such different definitions can create a sort of confusion when it, with regard to the regional or the African regional identities? We know that Africa as a continent is diverse, and there are numerous regional identities with their specific cultural contexts, and usually there is a form of grievance that's shared between these different identities, as they feel at one point they were stripped of their culture. So I was wondering, do we have to have one geography or to share one skin color so that we can share commonalities when it regards to African regionalities, or would or these disparities can be tackled by sharing one form of another of commonalities? Can you please clarify? When you were presenting, we could not find a conclusion with regard to identifying what's the African character or what's the African identity. Can you give us a brief conclusion that summarizes the disparities now we face in understanding the differences between these identities? Thank you. It's a question to the colonel. He discussed the fourth generation of wars. He focused on insurgents and non-state armed groups and how they can destabilize the current political regimes. These actors or non-state actors are different. And they might adapt some tactics or strategies depending on the geography they operate in or depending on the political regime they fight against. So, if we, for example, does the government need to consider different dimensions when it tackles or fights such non-armed groups? For example, what kind of security tactics they use, what kind of financial resources they use. For example, some of the political regimes might try to fight these non-state actors by adapting the wrong tactics, which might help these groups to go for external actors who are willing to support them, and this it creates some form of proxy wars inside the countries.
Yeah. I urge all of you to tell us from which organization you are coming from and your name.
Thank you, Dr. Tizita. And I thank the panelists, Idrissa and Bouhinia and Colonel Masrat, for the informative presentations. And I have just two questions. And for the sake of the non-Arabic speakers, I will just explain in English the question to Colonel Masrat. ولكنني سأبدأ بالتعريف. My name is Husni Mustafa. I'm from Sudan Embassy. So my first question للبروفيسور بوحينيا ولعلك قد
mentioned the proxy wars and transboundary militias, and I think this is something very important and it concerns the African continent. And my question here is, how do you see a way for us to end proxy wars through regional cooperation among African countries, in a way to prevent leveraging of different kind of cooperations? So had it not been for the internal militias that are being supported by external actors, these militias cannot continue to attack their own population. So how do you see this specific issue? How can we bring an end to militias in the region through regional cooperations and between African countries through the RECs, regional economic communities, and the African Union in general?
Actually, I like your presentation, and I hope it's going to be available online or to us through the emails. How do you see the war
تنتمي لحروب الجيل الرابع والخامس، كيف تقوم ب
Additionally, what do you think about the invisible wars of cyber offensive? Is it part of the fourth generation wars or the fifth generation wars? And then, plus that, the drones wars and the artificial intelligence wars. As a professional in the military field, do you think this is the beginning of the end of the artillery and the tanks in the future? Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you Ambassador Tizita. أولا حابة أقدم شكر خاص لمعهد الوزارة الخارجية ومركز الجزيرة وجميع المقدمين عن المعلومات القيمة. سؤالي موجه للأستاذ مسرت أدماسو. So I will be asking my question in English. Mohammed Yusuf. I am a law lecturer and human rights researcher in Wello University here in Ethiopia. So my question is for Colonel Maseret. Really interesting presentation, to be honest. But I will be
متعلقة بمعاهدة جنيف والبروتوكولين الأول والثاني. لماذا؟ لأنني أعتقد بأنها مهمة للغاية لحل النزاعات المختلفة، وأنا بالنسبة لي أعتقد بأن الحروب في الجيل الرابع طبعا هي معقدة، وهنالك حاجة لأن نقوم باحترام حقوق الإنسان ومبادئ الإنسانية بصورة عامة. فسؤالي باختصار شديد، ما هي الأدوات التي من الممكن أن نقوم باستخدامها لمحاسبة الجناة فيما يتعلق بمعاهدة جنيف؟ وهل هنالك أي من هذه الأدوات التي هي فاعلة بالنسبة للفاعلين من غير الدول؟ فهل هنالك أي من الإمكانيات لربما تنقيح معاهدة جنيف لكي تشمل الجيل الرابع من الحروب ويكون هنالك امتثال بالقانون الدولي الإنساني؟ شكرا جزيلا. نعم، أعتقد بأن الوقت ربما قصير للغاية وضيق، ونحتاج لأن ننهي هذه الجلسة بما أن هنالك جلسة أخرى كذلك، ولهذا لصالح الوقت أعتذر وسنتوقف هنا. والآن نعطي الكلمة للمحاضرين، فرجاء للمحاضرين باختصار شديد وبإيجاز، يعني كما نقول خير الكلام ما قل ودل. تفضل الدكتور، الكلمة لك. شكرا.
التعليق كان من الأستاذ هواس عن الحديث عن الهويات. الحقيقة أنه ورقتي كانت قرابة من مركز الجزيرة. أنا أحب الكتابة كثيرا وفي نفس الوقت أحب الحديث كثيرا، لكن بما أنني محدد بالوقت اختصرت تقريبا، ذكرت فقط 10% مما كتبت محاولة لكسب الوقت، فلذلك لم أذكر الكثير من النكات. لكن في العنوان نفسه كان هنالك صراع الهويات. الآن مثلا إذا أعطيت أحدكم استمارة وسألته من أنت، ربما الواحد يقول أنا إدريس، أفريقي، نيجيري، مسلم وكذا. شخص آخر سيكون إجابته مثلا أنا مسيحي، نيجيري، يوروباوي. والشخص الثالث قد يقول لا أنا عربي، يهودي، ومثلا دولة فلانية. هذه نسميها الهويات المركبة، هي هويات مركبة، لا توجد مشكلة في ذلك. يمكن أن تكون عربيا وأفريقيا، يمكن أن تكون عربيا سنيا، وفي نفس الوقت أيضا هوية أخرى متعلقة بالجندر، لا أريد أن أدخل في تفاصيلها. هذه هويات مركبة تصبح مشكلة. هذه اجتماعيا أيضا جيدة، وهو الثراء، نوع من الثراء على المستوى الأفريقي. تصبح مشكلة هنا يتم تسييس هذه الهويات. فالبعض مثلا في دول معينة تجدهم أنه يركزون على الهوية الطائفية أكثر من الهوية الوطنية. هنا تصبح هذه إشكالية، فتتجاوز الأمر من هوية مركبة إلى صراع الهويات. أيهما؟ هل أنا كشيعي أهم على كوني مثلا يمني؟ هل أنا مثلا كسني أهم، سني من حركة بوكو حرام أهم لدي من كوني نيجيري وأتعايش مع المسيحيين مثلا؟ هذه مجموعة من صراع الهويات، وكل واحد يحدد على حسب الأولوية أو قدرة الانتماء الذي يشعر به تجاه هذه المجموعة المعينة، أو ماذا يقدم له هذه المجموعة مقابل الهويات الأخرى. للتعليق على النقطة الثانية أيضا، نعم كان لدي ملاحظات، وهي الصفحة 17 عن الهويات. ذكرت أنه من الضرورة الهوية هو حاجة هناك مشتركات على المستوى القومي، الديني، الثقافي، التاريخي، الحضاري. يدفع الإنسان لديه حاجة للانتماء.
Shiites, Africans, Orthodox, etc. So we have to remember something very important here, particularly the struggle within the sphere or the landscape of identity. And this is why we have to look into the specificities here. And of course, I have seen many activists who thoroughly believed in the common destiny and having a common position, and then somehow, because of the outcomes, they are demotivated and they totally leave this concept of having a common position. So for them, if the expectations are not met, then what happens is the identity vanishes and another identity arises. So this is what I can say. Now the other point, to respond to some of the questions, why is it that geographical identity is not something that would suffice in describing an identity and a character? So I think the most important question here is, if it was only about geographical location, then I think we're going to miss something, because just being in the continent and having a common identity doesn't necessarily mean that we share the same common position. So the problem, from my humble point of view, is that we will have to take into account the issue of globalization. And if we are talking about the geography and the geographical identity, etc., so if you have your children maybe watching Netflix and somehow losing their moral point, or if they're influenced by the Turkish culture or the Korean culture, you see, you're going to have a big problem, because even though you're confined in Africa, perhaps the children are influenced by these other cultures. At the end of the day, you have to look into the lost generation. And most of the people who talk about the lost generation, of course, here we talk about screen time, iPad, TikTok, Instagram. So it's very important for us to identify who we are. We need to look into the commonalities between us. And this is pertinent, particularly in this difficult time, in line with the narrative that, for instance, being purported by the presidential candidate Trump. He says that the migrants are influencing the culture. So, for instance, for me, I think the election of Donald Trump in 2016 was an aftermath to the election of Barack Obama. And this is, of course, a common notion as far as the far right is concerned, even in Europe. And as I have mentioned, this is all from my end. I thank you.
شكرا. ردا على سؤال أستاذنا العزيز أستاذ.
Thank you. Thank you. Just to respond to what Hawass mentioned, and he spoke about the proxy wars, and he also talked about different issues, and perhaps we can talk about it for prolonged period, because in Algeria, you know that, of course, a revolution was massive, and I'm talking about the youth who have sacrificed their lives and stood against the rogue elements in our country. And as I have mentioned, it was an important revolution, a historic revolution is the biggest conducted by Arabs. So now, as far as proxy war, if you look into the definition by Karl Misch, I think this does not necessarily hold true in Algeria. And the notion that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. You see, this kind of notion sometimes is being used in some countries, not necessarily in Africa, but also in other countries. So, for instance, you see the Soviet Union, the Bandung Conference in China. We have a strategic relationship with them as well. So, in this instance, we can not only talk about a sponsor or a proxy, but rather we can talk about friendship built on different principles. Now, as far as the question posed by my colleague here, the proxy war, if we look at the notion of proxy war, we'll see that there are causes to this, mostly because of the fragility of the state. And this is from a political standpoint. You have these countries that have gained independence over the past 5 decades. I think 75 in 2024 is called the election year, because 75 countries in the world will have elections, and many of the African countries do have election in Africa, and most of the time in Africa we have this postponement of election, etc. And some countries do not know constitution. For instance, you see the Libyan case. So the third point is, once we know the problem, we will not be surprised. So the military sometimes is ethnicized, and it creates some kind of division. So if there are some ethnic division, many African countries are going to have a problem with promoting the notion of citizenship. And we know that Africa is perhaps a double-edged sword, if you like. And we also see corruption, and there are many research talking about the lack of professionalism, corruption, and Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. Of course, you see that they have exited the Sahel, mostly because of the fact that there's absence of a strong army in the Sahel, and they're trying to reassess their position to build their capabilities. And then you see the foreign interventions. The foreign intervention, I'm talking about 200 companies, Chinese, Americans, British, Israeli, and they have different names, and all these have drones, they have tanks, they have artillery, as the journal mentioned, the 4th generation warfare. So the drones are actually even being used by the security companies. So I'm not to say that Africa is the landscape for all these wrong elements, but I can say that if we want to establish a strategic approach, so we need to have approachment between security and development. And this needs us to look into 3 main issues: civil society approach. Now we see that most of the problems in Africa could have been addressed through preventive diplomacy. For instance, Darfur, and the intervention. Of course, you see the panel of the wise could have solved it. Now the second is the military strategic approach. And unfortunately, many of the African countries do not have strong military. So, for instance, if you see another example outside the continent, Lebanon, you see, they do not have the capabilities. Syria, for instance. So, somehow their military has weakened. And the same notion applies to many African countries as well. And the third point is the political re-engineering, political life re-engineering. So this is something important as well, and I always like to repeat, we have to think globally and act locally. So we need to think in a meaningful, specific way. So quite frankly, what Mr. Faras mentioned about Ethiopia is something that we did not know. And we love Ethiopia, we love Addis Ababa. We believe that Addis Ababa is going to be the springboard for development in Africa, but this requires a mature civil society organization. And Jean Magdal spoke about the matrix of strong nations. So either we talk about a fragile or we talk about a strong country, and so we all want to have a strategic vision, and we have executive and we have legislative power, and we also have a strong civil society organization. So I think we need to expand a lot of efforts, take painstaking efforts. We also need to understand how Israel mentioned to penetrate the African Union, and you saw how Algeria managed to expel Israel from auspices of the African Union. And the last point here is, as far as Algeria is concerned, I think Algeria, of course, has painstaking efforts, and I call upon you to read the book Fighting Radicalization in Algeria. So we have more than 100,000 lives lost, and still we are prevailing here, and this is what actually leading to our stability. And we perhaps are a very good example that can help neighboring countries benefit from, because at the end of the day we need to understand that we live in an uncertain period and we have a lot of uncertainties. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Of time, I will try to respond only 2-3 questions. In the case of proxy war, just as you mentioned, Doctor, proxy war, just one of the mechanisms.
الأدوات المستخدمة لزعزعة الأمن والاستقرار.
And other mechanisms. Therefore, guerrilla war, proxy war is one of the character of fourth generation, because nation states will not come to attack another nation states directly, but they are using proxy by giving technologies, by giving ideas, by giving different supporters. That's why just we are saying decentralized logistic. Logistic will just insurgents, guerrillas, and piracies, they will get logistic support everywhere. Therefore, proxy will categorized as a fourth generation warfare because of its nature. And
كما ذكرت زميلي العزيز، نحن لدينا تحديات في أفريقيا، لدينا العديد من الأيادي التي تتدخل في السودان وفي إثيوبيا وفي بلدان مختلفة، وهنالك اهتمامات مختلفة، ولهذا لكي نقوم بتفادي هذه التحديات فإننا نحتاج لأن نعمل معا، ونحتاج لأن نقوم بتحديد الدول التي تقوم بمساعدة العناصر المارقة والميليشيات. فهنالك تابعات كارثية لهذه الظاهرة، وأود أن أذكر النقطة التالية، وهي فيما يتعلق بالحرب السبرانية، فبلا شك هي في الخانة الخامسة من الحروب أو الجيل الخامس. فهنالك استخدام للتكنولوجيا والأمن السبراني وما إلى ذلك، وأنا في مستهل عرضي حاولت أن أركز على الاستفادة من التكنولوجيا والتقنية الحديثة، بدلا من فقط الاستفادة من المقاربات المألوفة بالنسبة لنا التي هي رائجة في أفريقيا. فنحن على سبيل المثال لدينا قوات احتياطية أفريقية، والقوة الاحتياطية الأفريقية طبعا تم إنشاؤها لكي يكون هنالك احترام لمبادئ مختلفة، بما في ذلك معاهدة جنيف. فلهذا نحن نحتاج أن نقوم بالترويج للتدريب وبناء القدرات وكذلك تطوير التكنولوجيا لكي نصل إلى هذا المبتغى. والنقطة التالية بلا شك هنا نحن نتحدث عن حرب الغابات وحرب الغوريلا كما يسمى في أفريقيا، ولكن هنالك استفادة من التكتيكات الجديدة، هنالك أدوات جديدة يتم استخدامها، التكنولوجيا والمقاربة السابقة كانت فقط إحداث الضرر أو الكر والفر، هذه كانت المقاربة. ولكن الآن هنالك مقاربة مختلفة، ولا سيما فيما يتعلق بالإضرار بالبنى التحتية في القارة الأفريقية. ولهذا نحن نحتاج لأن نتخذ مبادرات مختلفة وقرارات لكي نقوم بالحد من هذه الظواهر، وأيضا لكي نفهم أن هنالك استخدام لتكتيكات جديدة، أفكار جديدة وتكنولوجيات حديثة. فإذن نحتاج لأن نركز على هذه المسائل لكي نقوم بالتعامل مع مثل هذه المعطيات. شكرا جزيلا لكم. إذن شكرا. حسنا، أعتقد بأننا انتهينا من الجلسة الثانية، وبلا شك تعلمنا الكثير فيما يتعلق بالمفاهيم الكبيرة، الهوية الأفريقية، الحروب بالوكالة، وكذلك الجيل الرابع من الحروب. فكل هذه المسائل تم تطرق لها من قبل المحاضرين الثلاثة، وهذا إن دل يدل على المقاربة التي نحتاج إليها نحن في أفريقيا لكي نقوم بالتعامل مع هذه التحديات المختلفة. وبهذا نود أن أشكر المحاضرين على مداخلاتهم وعروضهم، وبلا شك تعلمنا الكثير. وكذلك أود أن أشكر المشاركين على مشاركتهم وصفقة حارة للمحاضرين. شكرا جزيلا.